Hey, welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
We're going to continue today to promote biblical worldview, and I love this book that we're talking about because it really is a mega deep dive into exactly, even today, the topic of language and how important language is. It is such a powerful thing, the Christian worldview, explaining the world in which we live in today. And I hope we shed a lot of exciting insight on that. But before we get to that, we're just enjoying the season that we're in here, especially as it relates to the expansion that's happening. Yeah. Lots of activity.
Yeah, I was telling Pastor Ron, driving in today, I was like, am I in Crown Point or am I in downtown Chicago? I mean, there's long lines, construction, there's cranes moving, there's metals being moved.
We got massive girders being removed from trucks and being basically staged because we're not quite ready for that. And then we got a massive concrete pumping truck going on and dozens of people working. It's really exciting. The pad is coming into shape. And pretty soon we'll start moving from the horizontal level to the vertical level with steel girders going up. It's really, really fun.
Yeah, and then we are approaching the recommitment for our Now campaign too. So that's been exciting.
In fact, this is our third go-around. We'll be entering year 3 of a 3-year campaign commitment. We encourage those of you that are listening to consider helping us out. If you haven't, we just have one more year left, and we had our recommitment dessert a couple nights ago that was really great. This Sunday, everybody will be making a commitment, actually. This is our recommitment Sunday, just prior to or coming up after this podcast. And then we'll be finishing strong for the last year. By June of 2024, Lord willing, we will be in the new sanctuary and celebrating. So, again, praise God for all that's going on.
And what we're asking is simply for people to pray. Yeah. Ask the Lord and say, what is my part in this expansion and this thing that you're doing, God?
Yeah, it's really fun when you can do things in the natural or you can do things in the supernatural, and really the church is a supernatural organization. You can't become a member unless you've had a supernatural encounter with Jesus that changes your heart and changes your life. And yet I'm amazed at how the church tends to operate in the very natural dimension, just like any other organization, and it really robs God of glory and robs the church of a lot of fun, So we've been encouraging people, don't try to figure out what you can give based on your budget projections. Ask the Holy Spirit, what is it that He wants you to do, and then just obey. And it's amazing how when we pray and obey, then we give the Lord the chance to be the supernatural, awesome, powerful God that He is.
Yeah.
So we've got tons of stories, and we want to encourage you, make sure you have your own story as you're partnering together with us to see God accomplish this. So very, very cool. And then we'll talk about tonight because we have a massive women's event that will be happening tonight.
Yeah,
at Living Stones.
The network we're part of, NRP, is having our Women's Flourish Conference starting tonight, I believe. I think a bunch of ladies from all over the country will be flying in.
About 500 ladies from all across, mostly the Midwest, South, coming up. It's going to be a really, really great time. Yes. And a lot of guys that will be serving at that event, so including myself. So we look forward to seeing you guys out, helping us serve the ladies and having an amazing time together with the Lord. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right, I hope you've been enjoying this podcast, especially as we have been, as Pastor Andrew said, in this incredible book. The book that made your world, how the Bible created the soul of Western civilization. And we're talking in this podcast about the topic of languages.
Now, before we get there, real quick review. I mean, in the past we talked about
heroism. I think last podcast
we talked about heroism. We talked about how these martyrs were burned at the stake. They were killed simply for translating the Bible and making the Bible accessible to everybody. Yeah. I want to tell you, for me, I did not know about Tyndale and all these heroes of the faith. So right now, I will tell you, I mean, I've been a Christian for as long as I remember. I have become much more motivated to read my Bible. Yeah. I mean, I normally read my Bible, but when I read it now, I feel a degree of treasure and honor and a sacrifice. So, I mean, everybody needs to learn this history to realize not the Bible for granted.
When I was a youth pastor, we would do a certain historical figure like every month. And we would highlight them for a season, because same thing, like every Christian should know who William Tyndale is. The Bible that they hold in their hand he's largely responsible, and so many of the great historical figures that create the world in which we live today are lost. Kids don't know about them. And like William Carey, who's William Carey? No one knows William Carey. Well, he's only one of the greatest missionaries of all time. Hudson Taylor. Nah, nobody knows Hudson Taylor. Yep. China would not be China today with all the believers that are in China without Hudson Taylor. So these are the folks that get lost in the process somehow if we don't, if we're not intentional about digging them out and sharing who they are.
And it gives a fresh appreciation to the great blessings that we have just all around us.
Yeah, that we take for granted.
We take for granted, absolutely.
So this topic today is on languages, and I love the subtitle: How was intellectual power democratized? So in other words, democracy is all about the people. How do we take the power of the intellect or the intellectual class and turn it into something that was available for everyone?
Yeah.
Great question, and we often take that for granted. He starts with a wonderful point. Anybody that's been alive in our world today realizes that, like, if you love your country and you are patriotic, you're attacked as a Christian nationalist. And I always scratch my head like, who doesn't love their country? Or when you see politicians saying, we need to focus on America first, or we need to protect our borders, because, borders are things that define nations. And then you got all these people that are irate about all this and calling us fascists. And, of course, the allusion is to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and that was socialistic nationalism rooted in the Nazi Party. Of course, everybody hates that, but they equate the two. And I've always scratched my head like, who isn't a Christian nationalist, or at least a nationalist? Like, who doesn't love America? We have a little bit of toleration for patriotism, but nationalism is like a cuss word.
Yeah, fundamentally, why is it bad, like, to care for your neighbors and your nation and the country that you are resident and you're a member of? Right. Why is that fundamentally a bad thing? Ask the same question. Right?
And why is globalism, which we would, fight strongly against, why is globalism for a Christian a dirty word?
Yeah.
Like, why is it that we're so worried? Like, the people on the left are like, hey, let's just get rid of all borders. Let's just be one big global family, right? And we'll just live happily ever after, and we can solve all the world's problems together, and we'll all be equal.
From somewhere in Brussels.
Yeah.
The economic forum, whatever they call it,
So we're going to kind of do a deep dive on all that today, because the Bible and missionaries and translations and all these kinds of things have been huge in helping us understand, these particular questions.
Yeah.
The author points out that Europe was once an empire that was a Christian empire. It was called Christendom. All of Europe was under a common, not language, but a common book that shaped our worldview. Mm-hmm. So people grew up understanding the world through the lens of the Bible. He says, in fact, that the post-Reformation, the Bible was responsible for reorganizing Europe into nation states. And the Bible provided a theological justification for fighting to build independent nation states, and he gives the example of Holland. So this whole idea that there would be borders and boundaries in different nations representing maybe different cultures and different languages, and that this was actually good, actually comes from the scriptures.
Right. And then having a empire and a large globalistic governmental regime is not good.
Right.
Because it leads to a centralization of elitist power, right, which leads to corruption. We've seen that over and over again.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit in just a moment in more depth. But let's take a look at the flow of language. He points out that, and this was really, really good, that when Jesus taught, he did not teach in Hebrew. He taught in Aramaic, because Aramaic was the language of the people. So Jesus is really the first major leader we see whose focus is not on the elite power brokers. In fact, he bypasses them altogether. And even his intentional choice of Aramaic to communicate to the common person, which is why the common people love Jesus and why the elite people hated Jesus. And I don't know that much has changed since then. He also mentions that the disciples, when they wrote the New Testament, they wrote the New Testament in a common Greek, a trade language that, again, the common people would be able to read and understand. Again, very, very strategic. It wasn't the high-level Greek, the precise Greek, the Greek that the common person wouldn't understand. Yeah. The gospel came to us in a very trade language type of Greek. And then it was years later that St. Jerome, little history lesson here, gave us the Latin version of the Bible. After the Roman Empire collapsed upon itself, Latin becomes the language that's used. And I didn't know this. I knew St. Jerome was responsible for the Latin Vulgate, but I didn't know that the word Vulgate is where we get our word vulgar from. Meaning, again, it was the vulgar means just common, and it wasn't the high language. It was a common language.
Right. Today, when we think of Latin, we think dead, language to be studied. But back then, that was the English. That was the common language of the people.
Yes. And then, so we had the collapse of the Roman Empire, and we refer to Latin as a dead language. Of course, you have to study Latin if you want to be like a doctor or a lawyer, because a lot of the languages.
I took 4 years of Latin. I didn't.
You did? You took Latin?
I took high school 4-year Latin. I didn't get much out of it. Anyways.
Well, and the local high school in town is known for having an incredible Latin club, because a lot of words in a lot of professions.
I took it back in Virginia. So. Different place. Anyways,
Well, that doesn't surprise me, because you're a brainiac. It is interesting. After 1,000 years after Jerome, he points out, nobody bothered to translate the Bible into the dialects of the people of England. And so this is interesting. So you still have services, high church services done in Latin. To this day, there's still certain Catholic services. The Mass is done in Latin.
Wow.
So, here's the people sitting there like a deer in the headlights, because they don't understand anything, and you got these priests going on in Latin. But what we saw is what happened throughout history is whoever controls the language controls the people.
Yes, that's the crucial point.
So, he pointed out, which I thought was really, really good, that unless you were highly educated, you came from wealth, or you were part of the clergy, you did not speak the language of the courts, of government, of religion. And so, you wonder, why did the Roman Catholic Church become so powerful? Well, I think part of it had to do with the fact that they controlled the language. And he goes in the book and he says, that part of the reason was anybody that could speak Latin was in high demand, so they became, professors, they became clergy, they became leaders, and the common person didn't have the time or the money to hire somebody to try to teach them, how to speak Latin. And so the language itself kept you out of really where the action was happening.
Yeah, power, access, authority. Yep. Their sacred text is only accessible by an elite group of people who have used the sacred text to make decisions, run your life, tell you what God says.
Well, and we find this today even in the professions. Every major profession has their own professional language.
Yes.
And you have to learn the language before you can get into.
It's a rite of passage. Yes. It's a hazing process. It's exclusionary on purpose.
Yes. Yeah. And he calls it I like this, a linguistic caste system.
Yeah.
So you literally have people in different castes, just like the Hindu caste system or some of the other caste systems across the world. But you stay, in other words, stay in your place.
Yeah.
You don't know the language. Stay in your place.
And again, the moral of this story so far is the same story told over and over again throughout the history of mankind. Human nature is a consolidation. Human nature drives to consolidate elitism and power at the very top. And the top says, we're going to keep our power. We're going to keep our caste system. We're not going to touch you guys. We're not going to engage you guys. We're not going to let our power, our wealth, our authority to be leaked to you guys. And we will insulate ourselves through walls, through fences, through gates, through money, through language, so that you have no access. In fact, if you're going to translate the Bible, we're going to kill you.
So this is interesting, because we talked about the Bible translators like Wycliffe and Tyndale and Luther, and why there was such a strong reaction. It was all under the guise of the common people shouldn't handle something as holy as the Scriptures because they don't have the intellectual ability, blah blah blah. But really, it was about power at the end of the day. It was like, we're going to kill you because you're not going to open up the Bible to the masses. That's us. Right. We're the keepers of God's word.
So that's human nature, and what Christ came is the opposite, and what Christians did is the opposite of that. Now, I want to kind of make a parallel. Yeah. I don't know, should we make that parallel right now to our politics today?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, we all speak English. The elitists, in D.C., we all speak English. So they're not going to change the English language. But what they do is they will try to pass a bill that's 4,000 pages long, and then says you got to read it in 3 hours, and we're going to pass it then and raise any objections.
We have a vote coming up,
And we have a vote coming up. And what happens is most people don't have the resource, the attorney, the time to go through. They have an army of attorney and resources to go and work through that, and they put all these things in the bill that has nothing to do with the intention or the title of the bill, and you have no idea what it is.
How about vague language that is open to all kinds of different interpretations?
Right.
I mean, these are all legal games, and it's all, again, power-based.
It's the same principle. They are using language to keep the power. I mean, even what's happening in Wall Street, the economic exchange, the insider trading, most normal people have no access to those systems and process, but that's the power broker that is not democratized, is not given to the common people. Right. They're using the same tactics that's always been used to keep the power to themselves, right?
So you got a guy like Tyndale who literally, in going through the arduous task of translating the Bible into the language of the common man, he literally democratizes language, in that point, and power, giving power to the people, and this is where we get phrases like knowledge is power, right? Because when you're kept out of the in group, the in information, you have no power. And he brings out the point in the book that the church became powerful because of language, but Europe was very weak because of no common language. In other words, when all the power brokers are speaking one thing, but the common people are left in the dark, you have a very weak continent.
Yeah, you're a nation that's focused on a group of elitists having all the power, all the creativity, and the common person, they're common by status, but not by gifting and ability, and they're made in the image and likeness of God. The nation becomes corrupt and weak, and it's prone to be destroyed.
Yes.
But when you give power away to everybody and allow everyone to have an opportunity to innovate. Unifies you, it grows you. There's a kid out on the street, he's poor, but he might have such great gifting. You can never innovate that gifting or cultivate that gifting to make the nation strong. Then you have a strong nation. Yeah. So
when these translators translate the Bible into the common language of the people, the only book the common person has to read is the Bible.
Yeah.
That's what happened. And so all of Europe, if there's one book, because books were expensive, if there's one book that you have, it's the Bible. So you literally have an entire population of people reading the same book, reading off the same script, learning the language from the language of the scriptures, and having their worldview shaped by the language of the Bible, which is why we call Europe Christendom and why we call Western Civ rooted in Judeo-Christian worldview. Is because the Bible was the book of the people, and it is also the foundation of why we are so strong and why we've experienced such blessing. It's because of unity, a common language, and a common vision that comes out of a common book, namely the Bible.
This guy attribute to. I mean, think about the island of Great Britain. It's a tiny little island. How do they develop one of the greatest empires, naval bases, naval power in the world? Well, it's because of these translators of the Bible who took the Bible, he democratized it. Everyone was learned knowledge, and all of a sudden Britain became a powerhouse of intellectual innovation and growth. Now, obviously, later they turned that into corruption, whatever. Right. But how they got there was because of the Bible.
Right. And so what I love is he takes England, the author, and shows the development of language. But then what I love is he jumps into his own nation, to the nation of India, of which crazy. I have no knowledge.
Yeah.
And again, we're dealing with, we hear these words like nationalism, colonialism, and they're all just terrible, terrible things. But he highlights again the difference between those who were, for instance, colonializing India for economic gain and exploitation. Yeah. But then you have all these Christians. And these Christians, like Dr. Henry Martin, These Christians come into an India that is full of poverty, full of disease, completely disunified.
Yeah, the leaders of their own nations just not caring about the unity and democratizing power. No, they want elitism.
No, and what you have is number one. Now, this was interesting to me, the difference between polytheism and monotheism in terms of what it does to a nation. Hindus are polytheistic, so you go into every different community, and every different community speaks a different dialect and has a different god, different deity.
Yeah.
Each of those deities has a different expectation, which means each of those people under that deity have a different understanding of what their duty is, in other words, what the law is. And so you have this massive continent with billions of people who are living in abject poverty and squalor, who are completely ununified, and the root of it all is language.
Yeah.
Amazing. In other words, if you're Indian just like me, we're Hindus, you're right next door, but we have nothing in common other than the color of our skin. We have a different deity that we worship, and even though we're so close, we speak a completely different language. I can't even talk to you.
Yeah, I'm saying, I'm going to start a business in between Maryville and Crown Point.
Yeah.
Well, wait a second. How am I going to do that? Because I don't speak the same language. In Maryville, they speak French.
And you don't have a national identity.
Yeah.
You have a very tribalistic local identity.
We like to eat this food. They don't like to eat that food at all. I mean, it just hinders all kind of technology innovation.
So the missionaries, like Dr. Henry Martin, come in and they realize, wow, if we do not create a common language among the Hindu people, number one, the common language, so what's the motivation? So we can preach the gospel, so we can elevate their well-being, so we can help them, so we can help them communicate to each other, and so that we can help build a unified nation, because you can't have a healthy nation if you're all singing off a different script. And so it's interesting to me that while we're criticized in the West, it was our biblical understanding that says, number one, we need to love our neighbor, so we're willing, like William Carey, we're willing to get on a boat and go halfway around the world on a trip that might kill us and could take 6 months to get there. I mean, this was not easy. To learn a language is very, very difficult. And not only a language, they had to learn all the dialects. And then out of those dialects, these guys were such genius, linguistics, they were able, through learning all these dialects, to pull out certain Hindu roots and actually create a common core language that then they could build off of to create a unified language. I mean, just think about how hard this is.
Yeah.
This is not to exploit these people. This is to help these people and to elevate these people and to bless these people, because our Christian worldview says we should care about our neighbor.
Yeah, and they were literally master craftsmen, using every gift and talent and training they've been given, linguistic experts, to be able to build a foundation of a strong nation for somebody else.
You can't have national banks. You can't have anything national. National means that you're all operating as one people.
Just again, imagine if every city in this region spoke a different language, how difficult life would become, and how difficult innovation, business, roads, government. We would be so much weaker.
Oh, absolutely. And easy for a nation to come in with a common language and exploit us and take us over.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we do work in Pakistan, and when you're in Pakistan, you speak the Urdu language. Mm-hmm. The Urdu language unites Pakistan. There would be no united Pakistan if it wasn't for Henry Martin, because Henry Martin was the one who forged the dialects into the language of Urdu. So it's a Westerner. It's a person from England who went at great expense and great risk and great dedication and labored to help create a common language in India today. And all we ever hear about is Western exploitation.
Colonialism and all that stuff,
So this is interesting too. Even after they created the language, and we talked about this in previous podcasts, there was no culture, no ideological, philosophical culture to sustain it, because they were Buddhist. And I thought the author brought out a good point. He says, the attempts to unify the people of India through a common language never caught on because Buddhism does not provide the motivation. In Buddhism, ultimate reality is silence, not speaking, and the path to enlightenment is through emptying your mind of all of words and all thoughts. So this is completely anti-language. In other words, we're trying to say, no, God wants us to communicate and to relate and to share. And Buddhism says, no, shut up and empty your mind of all words. I mean, you talk about how a worldview leads to poverty. Buddhism is a destructive, poverty-creating worldview.
Buddhism is chic in our westernized industrial culture because it's an escape from materialism and all that competition, all that stuff. In this context, it seems like a little relief from all that, right? But put it in its original context and expand to all of your nation and see what kind of results you produce if your ultimate motivation is to empty your mind and do nothing.
Yes.
There's no motivation to grow, no motivation to build, no motivation to care, no motivation to love, to care for your family.
So Westerners use Buddhism and meditation as a means of anxiety management.
Right.
But if you take it to the fullest extent, basically it's a total checkout of total reality, because ultimate reality is not here. It's
that is exactly what happens. I mean, you got Buddhism heavily influenced China. I mean, you got these emperors or these noblemen who they had an awakening, so they go and they leave their family and they go into the woods, they go to the temples, and they just
meditate.
Live out. And as like I'm a monk, and they're seen as a sacred person to give up everything. No, you give up your responsibility to care for your nation. You give up your responsibility to be a dad, to be a husband. Again, like, it sounds so good in that area. Practically, if my dad did that, I would be so wounded and hurt. Or in the old days, you'd die.
Yeah.
So it's just, but they were like, well, that's all nothing anyway. All the attachment. I grew up reading these literatures. Like, my attachment to my wife. Oh, that's all figment. That's all illusion. I need to get rid of the attachment to my family. You and I will say you need to go to marriage class.
You need to get a job.
Learn how to love.
The Bible says, love your wife, and if you don't have a job and provide for your family, you're worse than an infidel. And Buddhism says, in fact, Buddha left his wife and left his child to go off and find himself. It's just the opposite.
Yeah.
And it leads to poverty. So this is interesting. I think this was important. The East India Company was in India for commercial profit. They could care less about, all they wanted was people to learn a little bit of English so they could actually do business.
Right.
But it was the missionaries whose vision was to educate the masses. And I love what the author says. He says, the Bible teaches that the Creator gave us the gift of language because He loves us. Love includes communication, and communication of great ideas requires great language. Isn't that good? So this is the foundation of the motivation that led missionaries to sacrifice everything to serve another culture. So let's talk a little bit, because I thought this part of the chapter was so rich. He talks about the Bible and nationalism. And I'll ask you, how does the Bible give us the modern idea of nation states, which leads us to value this whole concept called nationalism? Why is nationalism a good thing, and where did this idea of nation states originate in the Scriptures?
Well, I mean, really, I think it started with globalism. It's the Tower of Babel.
Yep.
It's a consolidation of human power. It's humanism, which sounds pretty close to home right now. Consolidation of humanism, which people says we could be like gods. We're going to build we're going to build a Tower of Babel that's going to make us like God. We're going to build technology.
But just to put a comma here, that is the foundation. Humanism's first impulse is globalism.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way back to
So we can look at the tower, and we can all identify with one thing. The whole nation can see the high tower, and we can all be one, because we'll create our own utopia. Right. We talk about this in other podcasts.
So United Nations and all these things that we have now, this is rooted in the impulse of human beings to consolidate power under the guise of somehow creating global utopia.
Right.
And it comes from the pit of hell, because we go back to Genesis 11 and we realize that the first attempt, God had to step in and intervene. And so that we see nations are the creation of a sovereign God. When God dispersed the languages from one language to many, He was actually creating the foundation of nationalism.
Right, and He's saying, because of your fallen human nature, consolidation of power, especially on a global scale, not even on the national scale, in which there's a strong everything's constant. I mean, look at our federal government right now. It's utterly corrupt. That's why we need to have state. That's our founding father understand federalism, state and federal. Anyway,
so it's interesting. Okay, so now we get into states. I thought it was very interesting that he talks about how God made a promise to Abraham that Abraham his seed would multiply and become a great nation. Yeah. So this whole idea of nationhood, statehood, and nationalism comes to us from the Jewish promises that God gave all the way back to Abraham in the Bible.
Right.
And what I love is, I wanted to read this on page 172 in the book. He said, the Old Testament is the history of 12 tribes becoming one nation. Whenever Israel and the tribes were acting in unity, under God and under God's law, they were unstoppable. When they had tribalism occur and they were at each other, that's when they were weak. When the kingdom divided, that was actually the beginning of their fall. This is important, though. He said the 12 tribes become one nation under a common law, which was the law of God, the Scripture, overseen by elders with or without a king. The king's primary responsibility was their common defense. Priests and prophets helped elders keep a check on the king so that he lived and operated under God's law. And he says when these 12 people groups bound themselves together to obey God's authority, they flourished. But when tribalism overrode national identity under one God and one law, they went into slavery. Now, I think this speaks to where we are today. Look at who we are as a nation. We are the United States. We could say the United Tribes of America. I mean, our states are very much like tribes. Like Indiana is going to feel different than Massachusetts or Alabama. In other words, states have their own flavor. They have their own way of doing things. They're somewhat their own outlook, right? But we were always united under one nation, under God. We were a constitutional republic with a Judeo-Christian worldview. It was our worldview that came from the Scriptures that provided a national identity and a national language that enabled us, even though we were separate and different, enabled us to function as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So what's happening now? The more biblically illiterate we become, the more divided we become. The more divided we become, the more weak we become. And if we're not careful, we can learn from history. If we start speaking a different language, like we talk, for instance, now instead of equality, we talk about equity. I mean, there's so many subtle shifts in our view of who we are. In fact, I believe one of the biggest problems in America today is we are losing a sense of national identity.
Absolutely. Or national identity or nationalism is mocked and despised.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So, quick, because we only got a few more minutes. This whole idea of in the Bible, we see Daniel, we see Jeremiah, we see Nehemiah. The prophets, many of them were either trying to rebuild what was lost. In other words, they had a love for Jerusalem, they had a love for their people, they had a love for their way of worship, and all the major prophets were all about, like I love that passage from Jeremiah. He says, hey, even though you're in Babylon, we want you to love the people there, love that nation, seek to serve that nation, and then also love your people. In other words, Christianity gives us the impulse not only to love Americans, but to love all the nations of the world. It gives us a missionary thrust that most other nations don't have because they don't share our common worldview.
I mean, throughout Scripture, I just reread Nehemiah. I mean, the love, the divine call for him to love Jerusalem, to love his people. Even though he served the king very well, he was a very good official. As the king loved him, he had a place in his heart for his own people. For him to say, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice, take great risk, go back and rebuild the wall. Yeah. I mean, that's respect and honor. That's a value driven from the Bible to love and be patriotic to your own people. Yeah. That doesn't mean you don't love others. It doesn't mean you're going to invade other people.
It's not a perverted secular form like you saw under the Nazis. We're not saying Americans are great and everybody else stinks.
Our heritage is to destroy every nation and put them under America's rule. That's not the rule.
No. That is a secularized version. What we say, and I love this is the difference between polytheism and monotheism. The gospel says there's one God, and he is ruler over the whole world. Yeah. And so when you have an understanding of one God, one King, and then you have the Scriptures, which is basically the external critique, right? The external objective critique of how well you're living as a nation before God. In other words, it's not your opinion versus my opinion. Right. It's God's opinion. Right. If God says something is wrong, then we need to hold up the plumb line, right, the standard, and we need to say, hey, that's wrong. That's evil. Yeah. And that's what keeps nations healthy. And guess what? God's law applies to all nations, whether they acknowledge Him or not. Which is why a little plug here. If you're listening to this, we will have just started a series at Living Stones on King and Country, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Yeah. That is the message of hope. That is the true globalism. It is the fact that there is one king. He is wonderful. He rules the nations of the world. He's given us His law. And we're going to talk about how blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people He's chosen for His inheritance. But it all comes from language and the unifying power of language and the empowering aspect of language, and yet an understanding that nation states, borders, nationalism, patriotism, all of these things are good things when they're understood from a biblical perspective.
Absolutely, and they're necessary for the sustaining, the health, the consistency, the order of a nation, for a nation to remain stable enough for it to thrive.
Amen. That's good. Not only good, but necessary.
Absolutely necessary.
Necessary.
If you want to destroy a nation, just keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah. So anyway, I hope you're enjoying this as much as we're enjoying this.
These are things that I'm like, how could I never have learned this? All my years of being a Christian, these are crucial things that I'm like, oh my goodness.
And this is why we do a Pulpit Freedom Sunday, and just a Freedom Sunday on the Sunday close to the 4th of July is probably not enough, because these are the kind of things that if we don't restore this truth and it's lost, it literally leads to the destruction of your nation. These are foundational truths, critical truths that we've got to understand ourselves, and then we have to share them with the next generation. So we're going to be announcing too at Living Stones, we're going to be doing a class on biblical civil like government, like understand biblical citizenship, trying to recover a lot of these national kind of truths, like what does it mean to be a patriot? What does it mean to be Christian nationalism? Why should we love our country? Why should we love the nations of the world? What does it mean to function as a good citizen in a constitutional republic? These are really, really important things. I think we're going to be starting that probably in June, I guess. So we'll have more information on that later. But thank you so much for joining us today. Please like the podcast, share the podcast, give us some reviews online, help us spread the word. All right, we'll see you next Thursday.